Well, a week to go for the union budget, and joining me now to discuss the findings of the CNBC TV 18 Forbes BMR Advisors pre-budget CEO poll, Gokul Chaudhary, Mukesh Bhatani, Vipin Sondhi, and our very own Saurabh Mazumdar. Gentlemen, let's now talk about the Trump world. I mean, the Trump times have started, tweets, off-the-cuff press conferences and so on and so forth. And it's reflected in our poll here. Will protectionist rhetoric impact India's growth? 39% believe that it will. 61% believe that it won't. Mukesh, are we perhaps being a bit too sanguine about how the world is changing?
So I'm not a foreign policy expert, so it's difficult for me to interpret this, but I was also pleasantly surprised.
You're a corporate tax expert, and if Mr. Trump is bringing down corporate taxes to about 15% or 18%, yes, what will the implications be for emerging markets like India?
So I think, whatever US does as a part of the new administration is one part, and there is very limited control that we have. I think what's important is what is it that India should be doing to react to this. So 2-3 aspects. Number one, can we get a little bit more firm and aggressive on our foreign trade policy? So if US has already indicated that they're going to exit from the TPP, then what is it that India should be doing? So I would say that we should change our stance insofar as our trade negotiations with EU is concerned, rather than holding on to our position.
The India-EU FTA has been stuck for over a decade now.
And we continue to take even more and more difficult positions. So we should change tack, given what's happening around us. 2, if a lot of money is going to travel back to the US because of the change in interest regime there, what is it that we should do to attract more capital in our country? And that could be by way of interest rates. Now, we have 4 forms of withholding tax on interest rates, ranging from 5% to 20%. Why can't we rationalize it as a part of the budget exercise?
Just on the withholding tax, the exemption that was provided, that lapses this year. You think that is going to continue, or you think that that's going to go?
I mean, I would logically feel that it should continue, in addition to rationalizing the overall rate. So how is it that we can bring the withholding tax rate to single digits? Number 3, if the corporate tax rates in US is going to come back, you will see a rush of US corporations wanting to repatriate money back to the United States, in which case we need to focus on our overall tax structure. Because with the effective corporate tax rate of 34%, with an effective dividend distribution tax rate of almost 20%, we become a very, very uncompetitive country to do business purely from a tax viewpoint.
There was a roadmap that was laid out to 25% over 4 years. We haven't really moved the needle much. Do you believe that, given the fact that there is this big global reset underway, that we may perhaps see a more aggressive, more than a 1% kind of cut towards that 25%? Or do you believe that maybe there'll be a recalibration of the 25%?
My personal view is that we lost the opportunity certainly in 2016, if not in 2015. We laid out a very comprehensive roadmap for taking away all forms of exemptions. We should have announced a roadmap in the 2016 budget. And now, given what's happening across the world with the impact of demonetization, I would suggest that we be far more aggressive in reducing the corporate tax rate and bank on the compliance rate that's going to push up the overall tax collection. But I do not know, given the net rise in corporate tax collection of 4.5% until the 3rd week of December, how much flexibility does the finance minister have? Unless he's expecting a fairly high tax collection on the individual tax side. But please bear in mind that our basket of individual and corporate tax collection is about 45-55. So you need to see a far more accelerated tax collection on the personal income tax side to be able to make it up for the corporate side.
Okay. Gokul?
Well, I think 2 things in addition to what Mukesh said. One, I think the finance minister is very conscious that he's walking into a major change on the indirect tax side, which is GST rollout and his commitment to the states. Given that his entire budget sits on two limbs. One is direct taxes and the other is indirect taxes. If indirect taxes is going to be complete zero budgeting this year, is he really going to be very bold on the direct tax side? When one would suspect not. And therefore, I agree with the point that 15, 16, and maybe 18 should have been the year in which direct taxes should have actually moved the needle, leaving this year for the GST to stabilize in this country. The second part which is there is that insofar as direct taxes is concerned, more and more countries around the world are coming back and saying, look, we were going to reduce our corporate tax rates materially if we can attract investment and create jobs. And I think that is more and more of a lever that we are seeing around the world. And for the finance minister to honor his commitment to bring it down to 25%, he effectively has got this budget and the next budget. So he really has a very, very tight window to do this. So I guess he should be thinking very hard about how he's going to do that. Because the expectation from industry is not just on the corporate tax rate, but also marginally on the MAT rate, because that is hurting too.
But do you expect any change as far as the MAT is concerned? You know, every year we have the same conversation. Do you expect any change on MAT?
Well, my only comment is that the MAT started with 7.5% when our corporate tax rates were 35%. So today an 18.5% MAT just does not make any sense. So what you're really doing, you're doing two things by levying such high rate of MAT. One, you're helping corporates build an asset in the balance sheet because eventually you'll have to set it off. Second, there are many businesses, particularly on the natural resources side, who are unlikely to make money in the next few years, and they will be in a situation where they will have to write off these assets because you have a 10-year threshold beyond which you cannot carry the MAT. So I would expect that it's not just that the MAT rates should be rationalized and bear a semblance to your corporate tax rate, but it should also mean that corporates who are unable to absorb it within the 10-year period should get an extension. Because you're really carrying that balance sheet which, amount as on the asset side of the balance sheet, which has no meaning.
So, Mr. Sondhi, as a foreign investor who's invested in India, who's making in India, how concerned are you by what you hear from President Trump, from what you hear from Prime Minister Theresa May, and what does it mean for foreign investors who are putting incremental money into emerging markets like India?
I think I would agree with your question, what Mukesh says. What is it that we can do to aggressively cut down corporate taxation from 34% to 20% and remove all incentives? Then you become at par with the UK, with Singapore, so at least on that you're on a kind of level playing field. Will USA attract more investments? It seems so. There's going to be infra spending, so it does seem that will happen. So my sense is from the poll that people still feel that we will be less affected is because we have the ability to create domestic demand. We have that ability. Now, and
maybe because he hasn't called us out specifically. I mean, it's constant references to China and Mexico and so on and so forth, and maybe he hasn't called out India yet. So maybe that gives us hope.
Also, the companies that were export-led, countries that were export-led, like China and Southeast Asia, are going to be impacted far more than us.
We're less than 1% of global trade. So
absolutely. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't increase global trade, which means we should take advantage of Brexit, and we should get in very, very quickly with the UK and EU separately. But primarily stimulation of domestic demand and creation of jobs here, which is why I think the sense was it can be done with India as a domestic market.
Saurabh, you know, one of the interesting ideas that Uday Kotak sort of put on the table when I was having a conversation with him was that the government should incentivize job creation. So he said, you know, there should be a threshold, and that's up to the government to decide on what number. But if an industry commits to creating a certain number of jobs, then they should avail of certain tax ops and certain tax incentives. Do you believe that given the fact that job creation will be a focus of the government, we could perhaps see some out-of-the-box ideas or out-of-the-box thinking on those lines?
Oh, absolutely. I think the government is very clearly aware of this massive, requirement. And I think whatever out-of-the-box ideas, of course, we can only speculate at this point. But I think the government is very clearly mindful of the need for jobs. And just coming back to this whole issue of protectionism, I think if this poll was probably conducted now, after the inauguration has happened, probably the results would have been a slightly different than what we see, in front of us right now. But I think there is a little bit of an optimistic tone on the results of this poll. But I think there is definitely a need to look at job creation of domestic demand, and whatever the government needs to do on that front, I think will need to be done. And out of the box ideas, absolutely.
Let me now move to the next question that we asked on the poll. What should the government focus on to improve the ease of doing business? 39% said the ease of starting business should be prioritized. 38% said resolving insolvency. 30% said paying taxes. 23% said enforcing contracts. 21% construction permits, 20% registering property, and 18% trade across borders. This has been the big promise, Mukesh, that the government made, that they will do radical things to improve the ease of doing business. Now, whether we like it or not, the World Bank hasn't really moved India much on the ease. In fact, we're exactly at the same spot where we started. So realistically now, within the time frame that we have up until the next elections, what would you like to see specifically in this budget, if anything at all?
So interestingly, you'll see that, resolving insolvency has been put number 2 on the high list. So I think we still need to see the impact of the new legislative changes that have been carried out by the government. But having said that, I think at a macro level, I think we need to translate our intentions into actions. And in the process of translating those intentions into actions, I think what we really need is a greater degree of accountability. To some extent, that accountability lies with the central government. To a larger extent, the accountability lies with the state government. So the DIPP initiative of now ranking states is an excellent initiative. And you could see an element of competition that has been built in as well as a result of that. But I think at the central government level, there are certain things that the government could not do because of the political logjam. So let's take a case of the land reforms. I think the government had to give it up and said that all land reforms will now be the prerogative of the states. We saw what happened on the GST as well. So all of these have pulled the entire ranking of doing business insofar as the World Bank ranking is concerned. And hence, the lesson for the government is that, if we are unable to translate all of these visions into actionable goals, we have a challenge. But I also feel that whatever the government has been able to do from a policy standpoint, there is a wide difference between how it gets implemented at the field level. So let's take the tax, the tax department and the tax administration. I think in the last 3 years, I have not seen this high intensity of administrative circulars being issued by the government. But the question is all of that getting translated at the field level? So I think there is a huge gap that we are seeing now. People have to be held more accountable for their actions or inactions. Then only we will be able to see a material improvement on ease of doing business. And I think that we still need to see some of the initiatives that have been taken. This is the commercial courts law that was passed. We still need to see many of the commercial disputes passing on from the district courts into these courts, from the high courts into the commercial courts. We still need to see the impact of the amendment to the Arbitration Act, which was undertaken last year. So I think all of this is work in progress. It is not getting reflected in the rankings at all, I would say.
Mr. Sondhi, as Mukesh very rightfully pointed out, that there is only so much that comes under the central government. A lot of your approvals happen at the level of the state government, and that's where I draw hope. Because if you see the competitive sort of ferocity with which state governments are going after investors, I mean, I've just come away after an interview with Chandrababu Naidu, and you should see the dashboard that he has, where he's monitoring minute by minute, every activity that's happening in his state. So as an investor who's actually setting up manufacturing facilities in India, what is your experience and what more would you like to see change?
Actually, our experience has been very good. So we've been in India for 35 or 40 years. And we've seen that some states are actually pulling away from others. You gave one example. We aren't in that state, but we are in Rajasthan, we are in Maharashtra and Haryana. And you find a lot more willingness to listen and to act. But sometimes all that action is get stuck in the administrative system, which also then needs to be reformed. And I think that's something that we can't overlook. For ease of doing business, the administrative system will have to be reformed, trained and retrained. But is our state governments listening? The answer is yes. In many cases, we're able to move quite fast. Just one point. Enforcing contracts is seen by at least overseas, and I think domestic as well. Our inability to enforce contracts is a major part of ease of doing business. And I think legislation can be put in place and accountability held to move this forward.
Gokul?
One of the things which is interesting is that this is not just about comparing with what India was a year ago or 2 years ago. It's about how we are comparing with a basket of countries.
Right.
And when you talk to investors, they provide a lot of anecdotes about how different countries in Asia Pac, for example, have really worked the system to be able to make ease of doing business very, very competitively. So, for example, something as small as getting a permanent account number, even if India was to issue it in one day, we will still not make it to the top 20 because 20 countries issue it within the same day. When you look at visas or immigrations, a number of countries in Southeast Asia are facilitating those for the investors. As a matter of fact, I heard from one of the investors who said, I actually wrote in and said, I'm going to set up an office in your country. When I came in for the meeting, they had all shortlisted real estate that I ought to be looking at, and they were willing to pay the brokerage for it. So that's the level of welcome carpet that is being rolled out. And I think we need to benchmark ourselves against those and not just what we went through 12 months ago.
Okay, which now brings us to the next question. The government's most successful flagship programs. And this is a surprise, huh? Smart City is right on top. 58% believes that the Smart City flagship program of the government has been the most successful. Jan Dhan Yojana, 45%. Skill India, 44%. Digital India, 35%. Startup Mission, 27%. And this is the surprise, Make in India at 21%. Saurabh, what do you make of this?
Well, I think it's the way the CEOs, remember this is a CEO poll, I think it's also being, you must remember that it's being from the perspective of how CEOs see it. So I think clearly Make in India, despite the fact that its, visibility has been very high, and, I think the translation of that is still, yet to make the cut as far as the CEOs are concerned. Smart Cities, I think, is got a lot of potential, and therefore I think that could be a potential game changer over the next few years. So I think that's where, the Smart Cities program clearly outscores all the others. And Jan Dhan Yojana, for obvious reasons, can be seen as a game changer. So I think I'm really not surprised at the fact that Smart Cities has topped it. Yes, it is a surprise that Make in India is right there, down there at number 6. Probably would have expected it to be slightly higher. But I think it's more a function of the implementation not being, or not living up to the kind of hype and visibility that we've seen.
Yeah, Mr. Sondhi, does this surprise you at all?
It does, actually. I probably didn't want to see Make in India so low. But having said that, I think it's to do with the ease of doing business. And we must remember there's a whole host of small and medium industries that sometimes do not get the same amount of hearing as a large industry does. But just as a suggestion, it would do well within Make in India to identify champion industries that can be made globally competitive, and then to align policies in the budget to make them actually globally competitive. With protectionism coming in, it's important to have some champion industries that the government of India, together with industry, drives forward.
Mukesh, there's a lot of talk around A, job creation, B, focusing on labor-intensive industries, SMEs. What should we realistically expect, or what would you hope for in the budget in that context?
Well, I think a start was made in last year's budget to give tax incentives for industries that are creating employment. Also, a different corporate tax rate for Startup India projects. I don't know how much can really be done. I would again bring back the focus on implementation. So the Make in India and Startup Mission ranking low doesn't surprise me, and I'll tell you the reason why. Not because there is anything wrong that the government has done too, but both of these missions require you to have several elements of the government machinery working at the state level, at the central level, ease of payment of taxes, ease of resolving disputes. So you have to lay if you have to give a context to these two, to the previous survey, why India is ranked on, that it's not easy to start the business. Gokul talked about the example of permanent account number.
So in a sense, it's linked to what we're seeing
exactly,
here as well.
Because to make in India and startup India successful, you have to deal with many elements as compared to the other parts of the government's flagship program.
In a large fashion, the government itself is involved, at least in the Smart City project. You've got the government involved, you've got international agencies and international governments virtually adopting certain of these smart cities as well. So maybe, and it's flown under the radar, so maybe this comes as a surprise. But we'll take a break on that note. But when we return, which sector in infrastructure should get the top priority in the budget? That and more when we return. You're watching the CNBC TV 18 BMR Advisors Forbes India Special.